Audience, and as you can see, we've still got one of our speakers to come, but he'll be joining us very shortly. Before I hand over to Murat from the head of BBC Turkish service, if I can just ask you to switch your phones to silent, and when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone, because we're broadcasting live this evening. So over to Murat.
Hello everyone, my name is Murat Nishancıoğlu. You're welcome to ignore my unpronounceable surname, just call me Murat. I'm the head of the Turkish service at the BBC, and now tonight I'm joined by a distinguished group of contributors. Now, Alexander Christie Miller, who has been working for the Times in Turkey and has been through all the recent upheavals in Turkey with some very strong reporting. He also works for the Christian Science Monitor and Newsweek. Sir David Reddaway was the British ambassador to Turkey. He's just recently finished at the beginning of 2014. And now he's out of Turkey. Probably he will have a clearer view of what is going around. So his contribution will be very valuable. Karabekir Akkoyunlu is the only person I least know in this panel. It's my mistake probably, but he recently completed his PhD at the LSE on comparative politics, and he is working on Iran and Turkey and on the concept of democratization. Now we are discussing the presidential elections in Turkey, and the title is The Battle for Turkish Presidency. Now this title may even be part of the debate, because in Turkey and elsewhere, not many people think that there is much of a battle. But we will see. Now I, as the moderator, need to speak very little, but just to give you a general sense of the situation in the country. At the beginning of 1913, just about 18 months ago, the AKP government in Turkey was probably quite pleased with itself. The economic stability was going on. There were two massive trials where scores of military officers were waiting long-term sentences, and the government was saying, okay, for the first time in the history of the Republic, we are getting rid of military tutelage. Another thing to be very pleased with, politically, they were pushing through a series of laws and legislation through the parliament, claiming that this will broaden democracy in Turkey. The new slogans were New Turkey, progressive democracy. These were the slogans of this government. By and large, the liberal intelligentsia in the country was supporting these policies. There was also a new initiative which promised quite a lot, and probably still does, regarding the Kurdish issue, the Kurdish peace initiative. So when all these things were combined, here we could see a government which were going in a progressive direction, if that's the correct term. And that was how it was felt outside Turkey as well. Many Western commentators and observers supported the policies of this government. Then all of a sudden something happened. A small environmental protest turned into a huge, almost uprising. And the Turkish society cracked open from the middle. And since that day, even those protests were crushed down by the police force, leaving 8 people dead. And it is still there in a way. The polarization is still there. And the polarization is at such a state that neither side wants to even talk to each other anymore, let alone any conciliation or anything. But throughout this turmoil, we had national local elections, which was like a referendum for the government and for Mr. Erdogan, the prime minister. And it turned out that he still had the support of much of his electoral base. He received around 45% of the vote, maybe a little less than the previous general election, but still a substantial amount. So despite all the turmoil, despite all the corruption allegations, despite all the oppression which was seen as an oppression against the demonstrators, so we had this quite popular, successful government. And now we are going into the presidential election in this kind of atmosphere. So maybe we can start the discussion with Karabekir, because one of the things that needs to be discussed maybe is, despite all of this, why is this government and why is Mr. Erdogan still so popular?
Right. Thank you very much, Murat. So let me start from the micro scale and talk a little bit about what this election means and where could it lead us. There's a strange mood about the current election. On one hand, it is a historical election. It is Turkey's first direct presidential election. Previously, the president was elected by the parliament, and after the 2007 referendum, it became a direct system of presidential election. And that has brought about several novelties, certain American features of elections, such as focusing more on the individual and individual's profile, his life story, his family, rather than party policies and ideologies, perhaps to a certain extent, but in a limited way. We haven't had democratic caucuses or even presidential debates. As far as I know, one of the candidates, Selahattin Demirtas, has expressed that he's willing to face the other candidates in a face-to-face debate. I don't know what the main opposition candidate, Ekmelet İhsanoğlu, said about it, but I know that the prime minister, who's a front-runner, as you've said, has ignored these calls so far. And this historic election is taking place at a very critical time for Turkey, as you've also noted, at a time of heightened socio-political tensions. So, but despite these facts, it is almost a dull election. There's very little excitement about it compared to Turkey's previous elections, including the last local ones. And why is that? Well, we can have, besides the sweltering summer heat, we can have a few assumptions. We might say that perhaps the main opposition's candidate hasn't really excited the opposition base. Everybody's trying to really rationalize the election, the candidacy of Ekmelet İhsanoğlu. There's not immediate passion behind them. He's not going on rallies, so it's a subdued sort of an election. But probably the main reason is it's almost taken as a given that Prime Minister Erdogan will prevail. The question is whether he will win in the first or the second round of the election. But that lack of excitement or lull shouldn't fool us, because it really is a critical historical election. I would argue that a win by Prime Minister Erdogan would amount to no less than a regime change for Turkey. And by that I mean, hello Fadi. By regime change I mean the next and most crucial step in Turkey's decade-long transition from an imperfect parliamentary democracy under military tutelage into a plebiscitarian democracy, which features a strong executive, a weak or compliant legislative, and most importantly, some sort of a direct, charismatic ruler-follower relationship that's periodically reaffirmed in general elections or and plebiscites. Despite those optimistic assessments or hopes among the opposition, some parts of the opposition who suggest that Erdogan's ascent to the presidency will actually render his influence less, he will be more distant from decision-making capacity, I believe that he will be a very strong president, and I think there are constitutional and charismatic factors for that. I'm not going to get into those, but I would love to open that up in the question and answer.
Okay. If I jump to Alex first, now you've been there, you reported a lot about what happened throughout last year. Still, some explanation is needed, I suppose, that yes, these are historically important elections, yes, he's still keeping his electoral base, but you witnessed those huge demonstrations, huge opposition, a period, very briefly, of optimism from the side of the opposition. Why does he still keep his popularity?
Yeah, that's one of the questions that I get asked most about Turkey, speaking particularly to foreigners who aren't in the country, because you do tend to read about Turkey filtered through the perspective of you know, the protestors and the repression of the protests and the slightly crazy stuff that Erdogan often says. And obviously the corruption investigation, which the government has, you know, these allegations, which are incredibly serious, the government has done an incredibly poor job of refuting them. The thing that more than anything to me illustrated just how secure this government is in its hold on power was the Soma mining disaster a few months ago, which you couldn't almost conceive of a situation where a government mishandled something worse in PR terms. Erdogan went to the site of the mining disaster the day afterwards. He said effectively that these were routine deaths. He then went to the local town, was filmed appearing to assault a demonstrator. One of his advisors then kicked a grieving miner as he was being held on the ground by soldiers, and this was, you know, broadcast across the world media. The advisor who did that wasn't even relieved of his post, and that's really a measure of the degree to which this government, and Erdogan in particular, is effectively bulletproof. And I think the reasons for that are really when you look at the sort of deeper dynamics of Turkish politics. The centre-right voting bloc in Turkey has always been basically the sweet spot. Whenever there's been a big centre-right coalition, they have won elections, and the AKP is this centre-right coalition, and Erdogan has galvanised it incredibly effectively. The other thing that really counts for him is that he's become a kind of an avatar for this very large section of the Turkish population, which is conservative, and which always felt excluded under the previous secularist you know, governments. And when you hear his slogans, like, you know, the new Turkey and the national will, which to outsiders sound slightly Orwellian, and I think are actually slightly Orwellian, these are ideas which have a deep resonance for a lot of Turks who have basically feel that they've been excluded, and that now conservative values are, you know, being expressed through government, and that they now have a voice through Erdogan. And when you see him speak in person, when you go to his rallies, you realise that he really draws on those historical roots and those old grievances of conservative Turks in a very effective way. I mean, you can add other things to that. I mean, after a decade in power, they've consolidated control over the state apparatus to a very big extent. Media freedom is declining, and I think that it becomes increasingly difficult for the opposition to effectively voice itself. And you saw that with Soma. You know, these images of his aide kicking a demonstrator. You know, these were, the Turkish press has become kind of balkanized. Either if you don't like the government, you will only read material that says that Erdogan is the devil, and if you're pro-government, you will only read material that says wonderful things about him, and which won't, for example, show this photograph of his aide kicking someone. So the government has become incredibly effective at shaping the overall narrative in the country as well. and that obviously plays a role in it. The final thing, which I should have mentioned earlier, because it's in a way the most important, is that the government is still perceived to have done a very, very good job on the economy. And you know, compared to 10, 11 years ago, Turks are much, much better off. You know, the government has built a lot of stuff, and they've allowed, or rather the opposition, through not touting development itself, has effectively ceded the ground of developing the country to the AKP. You know, the AKP runs on a platform of saying, we're the party that builds stuff. And so that's why these corruption allegations in particular had very little impact, because people more or less feel like they're still better off. You know, 10 years ago in Turkey, or 15 years ago, a lot of shopkeepers were being shaken down by police officers. That's stopped now. The AKP have stopped kind of low-level corruption, but instead it's moved to a much higher, sort of more organised level, and that's a lot of people are happy to take that as the price for what they see as a better life.
Sir David, now we are talking about more pragmatic things like corruption, day-to-day politics, people kicking each other, but is it only the lack of vision of any kind of opposition which can penetrate this government? We know it's a conservative society, so the AKP has its natural electoral base. But there has been periods in the past when other political currents came in and changed the equation. Now, is it just the lack of vision on the part of the opposition, or does this government, and then mainly Prime Minister Erdogan, does he have a vision which he translates to his supporters, which then comes back to him as support?
Well, I think the lack of vision of the opposition is a problem in Turkish politics. Also that demographics mean that a disunited opposition will find it very hard to defeat the AKP with its core support. But I think it's ungenerous to the AKP to say that really the only factor is the lack of vision of the opposition. Because whether you like them or not, the AKP are an extremely effective political organisation, and Erdogan is a formidable politician. So I think there's more to it than just the opposition. Perhaps just going back to the actual election, in one of my early jobs, my ambassador told me that you should never predict an election result, because if you get it right, nobody remembers, and if you get it wrong, nobody forgets. But I think everyone is fairly confident about the result this time. And even to the extent of the smart money being a first-round victory for Erdogan rather than a second round. But who will win? You'd find very few doubters about Erdogan. And I think it's important to see this election as one of three, which are theoretically not linked, but in fact create a momentum for each other. So the extraordinary personal triumph in the local elections for Erdogan have given him a very strong basis to fight this election, and this in turn will generate a context for the general election next year, which again the smart money would have to be on the AKP winning. I'd just like to make 3 points on what I think that scenario, if it proves right, may mean for Turkey. I think we'll see continuing concerns over the centralization of power, freedom of expression, and I think the reform process will continue in parallel through the legislature, but I don't see a weakening in the grip of power of Erdogan. And the key for him, if he becomes president, as we expect, is how to retain control of the party apparatus. And he's got to find a way to do that. And the outcome of the presidential election will have an influence on who he chooses as prime minister, because it really is going to be his choice. And a lot of people would say he would want a weak prime minister without an independent power base, because that will make it easier to run the country from up the hill in Chankaya. The second point is a lot of people ask, where is all this so-called conservative democracy going to end? I don't see that it's likely that Erdogan will weaken in his commitment to what he calls the conservative democracy agenda. Why would he? His supporters keep voting him back into office on the basis of it, and it's what he believes in. So I think we'll see more of the same. And he's already spoken about having had political transformation in this first period of office, and now moving on to social and institutional transformation. And I think, as we've heard, the forward-looking vision to 2023 is a very important factor in this. Because if we were in France, I think we'd be talking about the creation of a second republic. In Turkey, you can't possibly do that. But if you look at the difference of what was set up in 1923 and what we would expect to see in 2023, they will be very different beasts. And I would expect the celebrations of 2023 to be as much on what the new Turkey is as what the Turkey of 1923 was. He is creating a new structure, and I don't think that agenda is going to weaken. A brief word on international policy. I would expect him to continue with the same mix of emotion, principle, and pragmatism that we've seen so far, identifying very strongly, as Alex has said, with the oppressed Muslims around the world, but at the same time needing to maintain relationships with the energy suppliers on whom Turkey depends, and also on the West, who Turkey needs for investment and for the defense relationships in such a difficult area. So I don't think, despite the temptations and frustrations, he's likely to drop the EU ambition, even though the accession process remains very difficult. So what might moderate this push towards conservative democracy? 4 quick points. One, the economy. It's the key to the AKP's success, and he's got to be careful not to alienate foreign investors and not to drive Turkish money out of the country. He's also got to watch corruption, particularly in terms of the major foreign investors. The second moderating influence, I think, could well be the Kurdish issue. I think the Turkish government is genuinely committed to trying to find a solution, knows how difficult it is, and any solution will involve a framework for some decentralization of powers, guarantees of rights, cementing the idea of different identities within Turkey. So that, in a sense, is running in the opposite direction to the tendency to centralize power. And I would expect that deal as well to be relevant to other minorities in Turkey. The third moderating factor, to an extent, is domestic political pressure. But as we've seen in these elections, Erdogan knows he can rely on his political base, and he'll always worry more about keeping them happy than about making concessions to his critics and opponents. But still, he will listen, he will take note, not least because that dissent definitely has an influence on external opinion. And again, I think as Turkey moves towards 2023, and what is supposed to be a great celebration, he will want to be concerned about the damage to the Turkish brand, not just in the West, but in the region that we've seen from Gezi Park and its aftermath. So really the question, I think, at the end of it is, how conservative will conservative democracy be? And I can't claim to know the answer.
Thank you. Can I also introduce now Fadi Hakura, who has been commenting on Turkey for many years, and he's an associate fellow at the Europe program at Chatham House. Now, you missed maybe briefly the beginning, but can I ask you, we've been discussing, or at least pointing out very briefly on different aspects of this election. So David just touched upon it, but what do you think about the Kurdish angle of this? Because they are putting, it may be unfair to say that it's a Kurdish candidate, but it's a pro-Kurdish left alliance party. Putting up a candidate, what is the function of their vote in this election, and how can they influence the outcome?
First of all, I'm not as optimistic as others are on that Prime Minister Erdogan is committed to resolving the Kurdish issue. If we've seen so far, Prime Minister Erdogan has focused on process rather than outlining or specifying the substantive concessions that he's willing to grant the Kurdish nationalists in Turkey. Linked to your question is the fact that now an independent Kurdistan looks likely to emerge in northern Iraq. And I think that will have an impact on the rise of Kurdish nationalism and the strength of Kurdish nationalism in Turkey itself. What was once impossible now is becoming probable and likely in the future. The Kurdish nationalists have made a deal, it seems, with Prime Minister Erdogan to push him into the presidency. In return, they want some concessions from him, including regional autonomy, to have Kurdish language taught in state schools, to have the Kurdish identity recognized in the Turkish constitution. Do I think that Erdogan will grant these rights? I doubt it. Neither now nor in the immediate future. I think that Prime Minister Erdogan made a deal, seems to be making a deal with the Kurdish nationalists so that he can guarantee his ascension to the presidency and to guarantee the AKP to win the next general elections in 2015. But the real test will be after the next general elections. Will President Erdogan be willing to make a deal with the Kurdish nationalists?
Now, obviously, we are talking about the weakness of the opposition. Do we have to think about the opposition in terms of the existing parties? Did the Gezi movement, if you like, give us a glimpse of something else? So is the future, if we are assuming that Erdogan wins the election, is the future of politics in Turkey is still going to be limited within these structures, or will something else emerge, do you think?
Well, I mean, I was personally very optimistic and enthusiastic about what Gezi movement had brought about to Turkey's social-political sphere, and I still am. I, for one, see myself as part of that generation of young Turkish citizens who want to have a pluralistic, democratic framework, a new social contract, if you will. And I think in the long run, the benefits of this movement and the new thinking that it has initiated will become more visible. But in the short to medium term, we still rely on the old political structures, old political parties, and the processes. So one of our mistakes, perhaps, as observers and also participants in Turkey's future as citizens, has been to expect the change to be very quick. So, and that was observable in the way people who participated in or had shown some sort of support for the Gezi movement directed their energy and their wishes to the local elections, and they were devastated when the opposition, I wouldn't say crushed, but certainly didn't deliver what was expected in the elections. If anything, if one thing that Gezi movement has brought forward as an idea is that these people are not necessarily after a winner-take-all system. We already have that. The criticism was, we can't go beyond it. So the strategic mistake of the opposition parties is, and I would say the Republican People's Party to begin with, is perhaps to still be under the illusion that they can form some sort of a majority coalition and defeat Prime Minister Erdogan. But I would argue what Gezi movement has shown and what the Kurdish movement has been showing for decades is perhaps that's not necessary or even tenable anymore. And what we call the new minority of Turkey, perhaps the secular Turks, the so-called white Turks, could learn from the Kurdish movement is, in a non-violent way, would be to actually demand individual and community rights and push for autonomization, decentralization, and support perhaps the Kurdish process, not as a separate piece, but as a new arrangement for the entire nation, so that Ankara doesn't call the shots both about in Izmir and Diyarbakir, and there's a local will that determines the life and politics in those places. I think that's what the Gezi movement was about. Okay, we will not win the parliamentary elections this term and the next term, but we're still here. We're 40-something, even 50-something% of the electorate, and you cannot discount us. So it was a message for pluralism, and that message has to be owned by the opposition before it can be recognized by the governing party.
Now, one thing, Alex, maybe you want to comment on this thing.
No, I just wanted to. Sorry.
We have to. I mean, I want to touch different things very briefly, and then maybe in the discussion later on, we may go more into some of it. Now, one thing which happened during the last year, and everybody said, okay, this government is cracking up. The opposition, the secular opposition started saying that they're going now. The Gulen movement. Are they irrelevant now?
Are they relevant? Well, I mean, it's a difficult question because it's such an opaque organisation that I mean, I didn't know until the December 17th investigation happened just how powerful they were, within the judiciary and the police. But I think that what's most significant about the Gulen movement now is in effect their defeat. I mean, you've just seen this morning there were I think 67 senior serving and retired police officers were arrested, which marked a new step in this purging of the Gulenists from the state. And whereas in the past you could talk about, as you touched on in your opening speech, that Turkey had a state structure in which different interests had controlled different areas of the state and different ministries. You have this thing in Turkey, kadrolaşma, where different political groups will populate ministries and institutions with their followers. The Gulenists had very successfully populated the police and the judiciary. As far as we know, it seems to be the case. And so what the AKP is now doing is they're effectively purging the last institutional formal check on their control over the state apparatus. In the past they were allies of the Gulen movement. They were content to allow them to run the judiciary and the police, as their allies. Obviously now they're enemies, and so I think the defeat of the Gulenists represents the final kind of moment in the AKP securing total control over the state structure, I'd say.
So, David, one aspect which you mentioned is the foreign policy issue. Now, this government, for many years, were using the slogan, zero problems with neighbors. Now, if we look around, maybe with the exception of Greece, ironically, with every neighbor, Turkey has a problem. And on
keeps diplomats working.
And on the other hand, you mentioned that the EU was still the direction, but then there is the desire to be a regional power in the area, and the EU isn't being mentioned anymore too much in the political debates in Turkey. Firstly, is the EU idea gone out of the window? And secondly, haven't they failed about their desire to be regional powers when you consider that they lost their allies in Egypt, they sort of struck a wall in Syria, and they have problems with the Iraqi central government? How this thing will develop, do you think?
Zero problems with the neighbours is always an admirable aspiration, but you couldn't pick a much more difficult neighbourhood to have zero problems with. So I do have sympathy as a sort of professional with trying to meet the challenge. But I think it was absolutely right that Turkey should take the chance to open up new relationships following the end of the Cold War. And wrong to think that you have to make a clear choice between West or East. And actually the EU interest was precisely that Turkey should have these new relationships, stronger relationships, and the EU should benefit. I mean, the EU process is not going particularly well, as you know, but I think it's one of those strange moments in politics where actually the process itself is hugely important, whatever the outcome in the end may be, because the sort of one of the key drivers for reform from the start with the AKP was to link development in Turkey to the EU acquis. And actually, one of the absurdities now is that all the EU countries rightly criticise the handling of Gezi Park, but we haven't been prepared to open up the negotiating chapters 23 and 24 that would compel the Turkish government to look at the legislative reform needed that would address the sorts of concerns that had arisen. So, I mean, Turkey actually has a very fair argument that there is a political bias added on to the technical process of accession. At the same time, Turkey could do a lot more to amend its own legislation. And the old argument that, you know, the EU tells us to do our homework but won't tell us what it is, just doesn't wash, because it's a technical process. There's one set of laws, and you've got to amend your legislation to match that. I mean, you've got the answer to the exam there waiting. It's just a question of doing it. So I think that the EU ambition will remain, but I think the problem, particularly in a period of multiple elections, is there's not much political incentive to make unpopular concessions or to do things that make Turkey less competitive in business when it's quite clear that the process isn't going anywhere very fast. I mean, we haven't mentioned Cyprus yet, so I'd always have to, because it always comes up at some stage. But, I mean, again, a solution to the Cyprus problem, to which the Turkish government is committed, could have a very important unblocking factor on the EU process at this stage, wherever you get to at the end. But I think Turkey does have problems with all its neighbours. Ironically, I think the most important bilateral relationship, in many ways at the moment, would have been unthinkable 12 years ago, and is with an autonomous Kurdish government in Iraq. I mean, nobody would have foreseen that. But as I say, I think Turkey will continue to mix new relationships, especially in support of business outside the region, with its traditional links with the West. I think there's no doubt, though, the brand has taken a huge knock because of Gezi, and also that there was always a limitation on Turkey's ambitions for regional leadership because the Turks are not Arabs. And that's a huge impediment if you're looking at regional leadership. You could be an inspiration of a successful Muslim-majority democracy from which the gloss has now faded. But to actually be the active leader of the region, I don't think was ever going to work for a non-Arab country.
Hadi, you may want to continue on this line, but one other thing, can you mix it with that? One aspect of moderation that Sir David mentioned for the future was the economy. But then there are many people who point out that Turkish economy is very brittle and may be in trouble very soon. How do you think that they'll manage that?
If you look in the last 10 years, Turkey has enjoyed real economic growth rate, if you take into account inflation and currency changes, has grown on average 5.2% a year, which was quite respectable. And that was relatively easy. Why was it easy? Because Turkey moved from a low-income economy to a middle-income economy. What matters when you're low-income to middle-income is cost of labor and importing machinery. As long as you compete on price, you can grow quite rapidly. But now Turkey has become a middle-income economy. To go from middle-income to high-income, that's a whole different dimension. There, it's no longer about cost, it's about quality. And what matters there is innovation, the quality of education, the quality of institutions, governance, research and development, productivity. And on that front, Turkey is seriously lagging. And I would argue getting worse now under the current policies that the government is following. If you go back the last 30 years, only five countries managed to graduate outside of North America and Europe. Only 5 countries graduated from middle income to high income. They're all in Southeast Asia: Japan, South Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Singapore. And what those 5 countries show, you have to have a very excellent education system, a very efficient workforce, accountable governance, solid institutions. And on that front, Turkey, if you compare, Turkey is quite far behind. So Turkey now has entered a prolonged period of economic stagnation, meaning growth rates averaging between 2 to 4%, which is quite slow for Turkey's, at the current stage of Turkey's economic development.
But then, if I can throw this question to all of you. Now, one aspect we talked about was the economic stability and people supporting this government, this wide electoral base, because the economy was okay, people were doing fine, relatively, shall we say. It was mainly based on credit card credits, maybe. And also, that sector of industry, the Anatolian lines, who benefited a lot under this government. But they're mainly exporting to the Middle East. All the trade routes are blocked now. They can't go through Iraq, they can't
The
ship.
EU is still the biggest single market for Turkey.
But for that sector, the expansion was towards Middle East, to the Arab countries. Now,
And to Russia.
and to Russia. Now, all areas where they're having problems. Will there be a change in that sense? That the notion that this government is economically successful suddenly turns around, and people start saying that it's going down, and then they lose popularity. Is that a short-term possibility?
I think it's quite easy to see a scenario in which that might happen, particularly when you look at, there's a sort of core economic team who are seen as giving confidence to foreign investors. You have Ali Babacan, one of the deputy prime ministers, Mehmet Şimşek, finance minister, and Erdem Başçı, head of the central bank. And in recent months, they've come under growing pressure from a sort of coterie of new, slightly unorthodox, to put it politely, advisors. I think it's a sort of an open question at the moment whether or not they'll be forced out. There's been a lot written recently about Erdogan's ideas about high interest rates driving up inflation, which runs counter to orthodox economic policy. And if they depart from this economic pragmatism that they've had in the past, then I think you could, if there's some external shock, in particular, I think that they might struggle to respond in an effective way to it. But I think it's an open question at the moment as to whether or not Babacan, Şimşek, and Erdem Başçı at the central bank will hold on. And I think that's one of the things that you'll probably find out after the presidential election, I guess.
I would just add that the Erdogan's economic numbers have begun to deteriorate slightly. If you look at surveys now and you ask the average Turk, how do you rate the government's economic performance? It was very, very high, coinciding with his high level of popularity. But in the last 2 years, as this economic stagnation has begun to take hold, his numbers, these perceptions have slightly now turning negative, and increasingly so as the stagnation takes further hold. If we compare the Erdogan's election result in the general elections of 2011, he got 21 million votes, 50% of the electorate. In the local elections of 30th March this year, he got 19 million. He lost 2 million votes. Why did he lose 2 million out of 21 million? It's directly linked to the perception of the economy, that increasingly now more and more Turks have begun to perceive the economy negatively, which is having a negative impact on Erdogan's popularity. Still, this large segment of Turkish population perceives the economy positively. That's why he got 45% of the vote in the last local elections. But we're beginning to see this deterioration, and I suspect it will accelerate and intensify and deepen in future years.
Can I just add that? I mean, I think we have to be cautious about comparing different types of elections. The general elections and local elections are different things. And I just think you have to be a bit cautious about comparing statistics of two different sets of elections.
The local elections of March 2014 were portrayed by Prime Minister Erdogan as a national referendum on his leadership. He took front and center of the campaign across the country. The AKP mayors or candidates were sidelined, whether in Istanbul, whether in Ankara, whether in Sivas or Erzurum or Malatya or Gaziantep or Diyarbakir. Erdogan took front and center in the local elections, and those local elections were perceived by the Turkish public as a referendum, as a plebiscite on Prime Minister Erdogan's popularity. In other words, akin to a general election.
But not a general election. Anyway,
But
go on,
still,
argue
they
about that.
proceed as a general election.
If I could just add, I mean, I agree with Fadi that both in the structural terms and perceptions that the shiny days are not really there with us anymore. I usually am cautious to comment on economy usually, but I was recently talking to a few political economists, including Mina Toxos at Chatham House, about this almost anticipation of an imminent economic collapse, which is a horror story, but also which would change the playing cards, the hands in Turkey, and whether it would come or not. And most of them were advising against, putting money on such a terrible scenario, mainly because one of Turkey's biggest problems being at the moment the financing of the current account deficit, and that Turkey still maintains a degree of cushion when it comes to financing it through capital coming in from the Gulf Arab countries and Russia, which doesn't really have any direct correlation with the state of civil liberties or stability. Well, stability it does, but authoritarian nature of the government, but rather, as you also have pointed out, the pragmatic, the sense that there's a pragmatic driver at the helm of the economy, no matter what the political driver does, and that they're open to new investments. So I guess that expectation of an imminent economic crash in Turkey is probably a bit exaggerated, even though the trend is downwards rather than upwards.
That's why I use the word stagnation. Yeah. Stagnation means it's going to move sideways, which is unprecedented in Turkey. Turkey, generally, if you look in the last 50, 60 years, had a boom-bust economy. Rapid growth, followed by a rapid decline, followed by rapid recovery. What we're now beginning to see is unprecedented, in my view, in Turkey, which is stagnation. It's moving sideways. Slow growth, slow recessionary growth, that there's not much the government can do to reverse unless it implements some fundamental structural reforms, and that looks highly unlikely in the foreseeable future.
Now we've got about 40 minutes, I think, so maybe we should open the debate to the floor and take questions. Yeah, and on the basis of raising hands, if possible, I've got the lady over there, and then you, and then you.
Hi, David, you raised the point of whether or not Turkey has been or could ever be the leader of the Middle East. And you said that you think that it would be unlikely per se, just because it's not an Arab country. I thought that was a very interesting point, and I'm taking slight issue with it, just because we've seen in the last week or so Erdogan taking the role again of champion of the Palestinians. And I think it's had as far as I can tell, I'm not in Turkey obviously at the moment, but it's something that all Turks seem to rally around, almost regardless of their political allegiance, whether or not they like Erdogan or not. I think deep down a lot of his opponents even respect him for standing up to America in particular. He mentioned them in a recent speech. I think that's quite striking, and we had the visual proof today of Erdogan in his Palestinian posture thing, which was for me a very striking image. So I'd like to ask each of you really what you would define as any country, Turkey included, being the leader of the Middle East. What would that actually entail, and can Turkey ever be that?
Can I take a couple of more questions and then we can come back?
Thank you very much. I think this is a very interesting debate, and I'd just like to continue on what the lady just said. The illusion of Turkey becoming the leader of the Middle East has come to an end with the 30th of June revolution in Egypt. In fact, Turkey is seen as conducting a war by proxy in Syria, is seen as a country that has supported a theocratic regime in Egypt, that the Egyptian people has voted by their feet against it, and the access of Istanbul, Doha, is seen very negatively across the Middle East. So the Turkish project in the Middle East, which was actually a solution for the Turkish question to join the EU, has come to an end. Secondly, the Kurdish question. It's a very interesting question, that, because if you go back to the history, the agreements following the creation, the end of the Ottoman Empire, would mean that a new Kurdish state would have to ask for new borders. What is the borders of the new Kurdish state? No one knows. And this would create a very big problem to Turkey. Not only a big problem, it will actually create a big problem for the whole region. Thirdly, the triumph of Bashar al-Assad is actually becoming a fact. I think Egypt would move to support Bashar because the civil war and the horrors of the rise of Muslim fundamentalism that Turkey supported. And in fact, there are many questions that Mr. Erdogan has to face later, you know, as someone who supported civil war and hideous crime. The questions of Daesh is very serious questions. Lastly, Mr. Erdogan is not very well, health-wise. And this is a well-known fact. So what's going to happen to the Turkish project without Mr. Erdogan? Thank you.
Can I take one last one, and then we'll go back to the panel?
Hi, thank you. I'd like to ask Mr. Fadi Hakura. You've stated that you're not very optimistic about the prospects of Erdogan giving any concessions to the Kurds. So I wanted to ask you if you would not agree with the idea that, I mean, if we assume Erdogan, with his track record, that he's been a very successful hardliner in economic liberalism, notwithstanding his political conservatism, and given what we've talked about the economy and how much Turkish economy still relies on domestic markets, that would he not want to give some concessions and try and reap the economic benefits of approaching the Kurds until the market has been exhausted? And if not, wouldn't you think that this may allow the Kurds to go into coalition with other parties in Turkey? And as Sir David has remarked, that the opposition has been divided in Turkey, and which has been a major problem. And as Karabekir has alluded, maybe this approachment by Kurds for other coalitions within the country may give some potential to create future problems for Erdogan, perhaps.
Was there somebody else over there? Didn't you raise your hand? Yeah. Okay, well, why don't you?
You touched upon the freedom of press in Turkey, and I think, well, seeing as we're here, I think that's something that I think we should talk about more. Do you see that improving at all in Turkey, or and what, you know, yeah, is that something that you can see improving within Turkey?
Okay. If we go, yes, I think if we deal with again, I think that came from three contributors, more or less, Turkey's role in the region. But then if we can afterwards go about the issue about the Kurdish peace process, and then maybe I can also say a few things about press freedom. Please, yeah, Sir David,
you want me to start? I mean, thank you very much for your question. I should say Aleph Scott has just written an excellent book on Turkey, available from all good booksellers. I have no financial interest in this, but I do recommend it for your summer reading and thereafter. I mean, on the leadership role, I think the championship of the oppressed is a very strong theme. It reminded me very much of the rhetoric of the Iranian Revolution when I lived through that rather a long time ago. And it appeals in the region and beyond. And I mean, regional experts may dispute this, but I think, rather oddly, since the downfall of Saddam Hussein, there hasn't been a sort of regional strongman who the regional street can admire. And Erdogan is actually the nearest you've got, or was the nearest you've got, by standing up to the Americans over land access to troops, for troops during the war with Iraq, even though that was actually the parliament for once rather than him. But generally the Davos moment with Israel. And this championship of the oppressed, I think, did play very well in the region. And Turkish soaps played very attractively. The success of the economy played very well. So I think that sort of sense of inspiration was quite strong. I remember a rather senior and wise Turkish politician saying to me, at the height of the sort of Arab Spring enthusiasm and Turkey being an inspiration, he said to me, when we have a surplus of democracy, we can start exporting it. And I think the brand has taken a real knock. And what Fadi has described about the sort of quietening on the economy has taken a knock. Egypt policy, absolutely right. And I think for many governments around the region, easy rhetoric, if I can put it unkindly like that, because that's how they'd see it, about issues is actually quite irritating when it comes from outside, and it doesn't make for better cooperation with governments on some of the sort of nitty-gritty issues. So it's quite easy to take a posture on something the further it is from your own country. And I think in the region, some of the rhetoric has caused resentment. Syria policy has caused difficulty. Egypt policy, you're absolutely right, has caused difficulty. But I come back to the point that just as with the Iranians, I don't think the Iranians will ever be regional leaders, quite apart from their other problems, because they're not Arabs. I think that really does apply to Turkey as well. And there may be a nostalgia within Turkey for the days of the Ottoman Empire and all that influence. But as we in the British Empire know, I mean, the imperial power may have a rather different form of nostalgia from those who are enjoying the benefits of that imperialism. So I don't actually see real scope to go beyond the sort of rhetoric about oppressed Muslims and Palestine, Gaza.
Karabek, before you start, I was watching, we haven't even mentioned his name, maybe, but we are being biased here. Ekmelettin İhsanoğlu's, he was on TV, on CNN Turkey yesterday evening. And he was making the comparison of Nasser when he was talking about Erdogan. The way that Nasser, his rhetoric was always about winning victories and being on top of the region, but whereas in fact he was losing all the time. Now, is there an element of this in this when you consider the questions as well?
I think so. I watched the program as well, and I know that Ekmelettin İhsanoğlu, by his background as well, is not very doesn't look very favorably upon Nasser, and his comparing Nasser with Erdogan was actually quite significant. We actually wrote and published a piece about a year ago at the Southeast European Studies at Oxford with fellows. About the rise and fall of the so-called Turkish model, along with the rise and fall of the Arab Spring. And one of the things we argued in that piece, it was called The Western Condition, the Turkey, the US, and the EU in the New Middle East. You can go online and find it if you like. One of the things we argued there was that the promotion of Turkey as a model in the region, which was very much supported, of course, in the Western foreign policy circles in Britain and the US, didn't happen for the first time in 2011. It had happened again previously in 2001, 2002, in the context of the war against terror. It had happened in 1980s under President Reagan and Turgut Özal, and previously in the 50s under the Democrat Party government and its capitalist development program. So whenever there is a center-right, popular center-right government that is in power in Turkey, there seems to be this implicit support of Turkey as some sort of a role model in the region. But each time it has actually failed. And one of the lessons we can take from it is that maybe it wasn't in a very organic formulation, even though there was, and there probably still is, although declining, popular support for Erdogan and the AKP in the region as an attractive leader and vision for the region. But with the fall of the Muslim Brothers and the turn of the tide in Syria, that has pretty much lost its tinge. If I could just say something before I pass on the word, it would be that I think we should compartmentalize our analysis of Turkish foreign policy in the last decade, and especially the last 5 years. Between 2000 and 2011, when Davutoğlu became foreign minister and was really pursuing the zero problems with neighbors policy, it actually was a very pragmatic policy, and it worked. It did quite a lot of good to Turkey at that time, with Syria, with Egypt, and all sorts of mediation roles with Iran. Except for Israel, all the regional relationships are actually improved. The problem was that with 2011, the Arab Spring, and the promotion of Turkey as a model, something changed. And I would call it hubris. And perhaps a personal even instinct from Foreign Minister Davutoğlu and Prime Minister Erdogan that a moment had come now that Turkey's rise is unstoppable. And that hubris really took away the rug under the Turkish foreign policy establishment and brought it to where it is today, where it needs mediators to talk to its neighbors.
Fadi, can we go back to the questions on the Kurdish
Sure,
issue?
I'll link them. First about Turkey as a model. I always had a problem when Turkey was being perceived as a model, an example, inspiration, whatever the phrase, over the last 10 years. How could Turkey be a model when between 1984 until now, over 40,000 people killed in the fight between the Kurdistan Workers' Party and the Turkish state? Over 40,000 people killed. So the Turkey's economic or Turkey's political framework does not accommodate sectarian and ideological diversity. That's the problem in Turkey. And what we see in the Middle East is sectarian ideological diversity that's not being accommodated in Syria, Iraq, Libya, and other Yemen and other countries. The second key question: why do we find in Turkey and across the region Dirty Harry type political characters? Tough, very tough, combative, muscular leaders, strongmen. And this is a question I find we focus too much on individuals and not enough on the cultural and institutional climate, environment in which these leaders emerge. One issue is that we have in Turkey and the Middle East an excessive respect for authority. You'll find in Turkey, for example, in the Arab world, that most businesses are family-owned businesses. Most institutions are vertically organized. There is not much delegation of power to people down the chain. So therefore, this excessive respect for authority encourages tough leaders like Prime Minister Erdogan. The second aspect is we have a very conservative cultures, meaning that these are cultures that are suspicious of foreigners, that are in some ways insular, and in many ways, and also go for conspiracy theories rather than actual explanations for events. And the third key is collectivism versus individual rights. Turkey and the Arab societies tend to emphasize collective rights, that is the we rather than the I. And when you are in an urban majority population, like you are in Turkey, and now many of the Arab countries, what is important is the I rather than the we. Because when you're in the rural environment, you have the formal relationship, you have the network with your aunts, uncles, friends. So it's a very regulated, organized environment. When you come to the city, it's a totally different, it's like an urban jungle. It becomes like a jungle. And there, I think what we see in Turkey and the Arab world, the vast majority of the population has not been successful in making the mental transition from the from the rural mentality to a more individualistic urban thinking. As for the Kurdish question, what we have seen over the last 10 years in the growing relationship between the Kurdistan regional government in northern Iraq and Turkey is the growth of economic ties. Even at the height of the tensions between the Turkish government and the KRG, Kurdistan regional government, in 2007, 2006, 2008, when the American troops were still in Iraq, we saw those economic relations grow. Why? I think, first of all, many of these economic actors happen to be close to the Prime Minister. And second, also the Kurdish political leadership in the Kurdish, such as Masoud Barzani, were quite pragmatic and found the best way to bring Turkey closer and closer to the KRG is by encouraging these economic and trade ties and investment flows from Turkey into the KRG. I suspect that these will continue irrespective of what happens between the Turkish state and the negotiations with the Kurdish nationalists in Turkey.
Alex, before I go back to the floor, now you obviously are working as a journalist in Turkey, and you were saying before the meeting that every time we translate your pieces and put it on the BBC Turkish page, you come under more pressure. How can you address the issue of the situation of press freedom in Turkey, and how you experience that yourself?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, in answer to the question, is it going to get worse? I think that the basic answer from my view would be yes. I mean, you've seen in recent months the government passing several laws which have curtailed internet freedom and which sort of indirectly affect media freedom. And I mean, it's a lot more complicated than it's routinely presented, though. I mean, if you actually look at Turkish newspapers by readership, there's at the moment a majority of the Turkish newspapers by readership are actually anti-government, and often quite stridently anti-government. That's changed since the fight with the Gulenists. They control a substantial media empire, and they've flipped against the government now. But then when you dig below that, you see that, you know, a huge number of journalists are being fired, and then also the government or the AKP is very actively trying to take over, take over media organisations whenever it has the opportunity. By that I mean, I don't mean literally take over them, but ensure that when they come up for sale, businessmen who are allied to the AKP are able to control them. And then, and you saw that. I mean, there was an infamous example that emerged during the corruption allegations in December regarding the sale of the Sabah ATV group, which was admittedly already in pro-government hands. But Erdogan there, you know, allegedly acted to make sure that it stayed in pro-government hands in a very sort of questionable, illegal way. And more recently, you've seen, you know, Digiturk, which is, you know, a company that basically has a big influence over which satellite channels are available to watch. This is now passed into, I think I'm right in saying, state hands. And that's going to have a substantial effect, already has had a substantial effect on what television channels are available to watch. Just recently, with the ISIS takeover in Mosul, you know, a court put in an order effectively banning all reporting on the hostage situation there involving 49 Turkish diplomats. They're still held. It's illegal to write about this subject in Turkey, which is pretty striking, and is a situation which you couldn't have imagined, you know, 3 years ago. I think that whilst the Turkish government doesn't mind having media which is criticising it, it doesn't want media that's going to criticise it on certain sensitive issues. And I think that you know, that they will continue to be able to project the impression that there's a free press, because there will be newspapers which will print very critical things of the government. But I think that when you dig underneath that, the actual quality of the media and quality of reporting and freedom to do real reporting is dramatically decreasing.
Can I just say a couple of things on this subject as well? It is complicated, but I think there are two main planks in this problem. One is media ownership. That has to be somehow regulated, because media owners in Turkey are owners of huge conglomerates, and their media arms are very small in these organizations. And these owners have to go into a relationship with the government in terms of tenders and in other business advantages, etc. So if you go against the government, you lose out. Therefore, there's that pressure coming on from the owners, so that the media is a quieter, more tamer media. The second issue is, in terms of self-censorship, censorship, etc., the other element which is missing is the media has to regulate itself. The media organizations or the journalist organizations in Turkey are very weak. They are the ones who have to establish the ethics and the norms, and then apply them in their profession. There are no unions, or there are paper unions, or the other the professional organizations are weak. So those issues have to be sorted out, I think. If the press freedom issue in Turkey is going to improve. Fadi, do you want to say anything?
Just an anecdote. We had Deputy Prime Minister of Turkey, Bülent Arınç, who was a very close confidant of the Prime Minister and one of the key founders of the ruling Justice and Development Party, gave a speech at Chatham House, and he was asked about media freedoms in Turkey. And he openly, to a mainly Western audience, said that Prime Minister Erdogan picked up, when he opened the television, saw on, I think on a Turkish news channel, he saw the nationalist party leader in Turkey, Devlet Bahçeli, being interviewed. He picked up the phone and called the senior executive in the TV channel and said, remove him. And he said that openly in front of a Western audience at Chatham House. And the whole point of his speech was to change perceptions of media freedoms in Turkey.
Maybe he did.
So it gives you just an idea of the mentality on media freedom in Turkey is maybe very different to what one may expect or one sees in the West.
And bringing, sorry, just very quickly, bringing it back to the presidential election, which is the topic of our this panel here as well. And both in this presidential election, in the run-up to it, and in local elections, the figures of the state broadcaster, TRT, are outrageous. The amount of space and time they dedicate to the ruling party and Erdogan, which in the local elections was I think 89%, and then 11% distributed between the three parties, the three opposition parties. In this case,
even worse.
In this case, the opposite. I think 2 minutes for the main opposition candidate, and no time at all for the pro-Kurdish candidate Selahattin Demirtas. So that says something about the freedom of media, I guess.
Okay, shall we? There is a lady at the front, and over there I can see. Okay.
Two ladies up front.
I wanted to say that the UK was able to recreate itself several times very successfully after the Second World War. My question is to Sir Redaway. It's knowing the makeup and the understandings of the Turkish citizens, its strategic location on the map, and if you were looking at Turkey from Turkey outwards, rather than from Britain, thinking of British interests first, so that like you were advising the Turkish Prime Minister, what would you recommend for him to do as a strategic advisor after the next elections?
I think it's the lady.
I've been waiting.
Okay, carry on, and then we'll go over to you.
If you are talking about the presidential election battle here, I think I'd like to learn about what would happen if somehow Ekmeleddin wins the elections. Because, to be honest, as a voter, I don't know whether to vote for him or not. I want to vote for him to show, in case he gets any good amount of votes, to show Erdogan that he is facing some kind of a threat. But on the other hand, I cannot trust him to be any different to Erdogan himself. Secondly, this is for you, Fadhi. I've met you about 8 years ago in a panel like this, discussing the politics of AKP. And I was quite surprised to hear from you, as an Arab, to support AKP. You are quite supportive of their policies. And I caught you afterwards at Holborn Station and asked you why you were supporting AK party, because so far my experience showed me that Turks, Arabs in general, hated Turks and Turkey for being too secular and not promoting Islam. So you gave me your good reasons, but today I see a completely different approach. You are quite critical of AKP. So for me, you are representing the Arab voice, and if you can tell what made you, what changed your mind about AK party and Turkey's policies, I think it will give me a clear picture of how the Arabs see the Turkish politics at the moment.
Thank you. All of the speakers have more or less covered the Kurdish question or mentioned the Kurdish question, Cyprus as an obstacle to Turkey's possible entry into the EU. But no one's mentioned the Armenian question. As we all know, Mr. Erdogan expressed his condolences, albeit very hedged in, to the Armenians who died. And I wonder what your views are on the importance of Erdogan and Turkey coming to terms with the Armenian genocide before it can move forward into becoming a real democracy.
There's a gentleman over there.
You mentioned Erdogan's genuine commitment to the Kurdish peace process with the PKK. I wanted to ask the panel, and David Redaway in particular, what do you think Erdogan's perception of Abdullah Öcalan is? They're of a slightly different generation politically in the sense that Öcalan fought much of the war in the 80s and the 90s. Would Erdogan ever countenance releasing Öcalan? Would he rather just use him as a mouthpiece to communicate with the rest of the PKK that's up in Iraq? And I'm thinking specifically after the presidential election.
There's a lady over there.
I'm just wondering, I'm interested in the shift from center-right to the center-left, and it seems to be happening across time in Turkey. And I'm just wondering, that 2 million that was mentioned that voted for AKP and didn't in this time, is there a real correlation or causality between that swing happening directly from how economy is performing in Turkey, or is there, I want to put it personally as hope, from either other, whether it's AKP's general policy or some other factors that would swing that vote? Or is that generally just, 2 million here and there that changes their opinion, and maybe they were just on the fence anyway?
Can I come back to the panel again, because it's too many questions piling up. Now, one thing was directed at you about the British perspective in looking both at
well, no, not the British perspective. Yeah.
So I read away
Yes.
advising the Turkish Prime Minister from Turkey's point of view, looking outwards, as a successful advisor to the British government in the past.
I think it would depend how concerned I was to keep my job, for a start.
But if you were not.
But I think, yeah. I think what I...
And you were economically secure.
I mean, one of the... yeah, we're getting into the realms of the ultra-hypothetical here. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the problems with very successful politicians, and this is not a problem confined to Turkey, is if you're the politician who's won a series of elections, it gets harder and harder for people to give you advice that they think you don't want to hear. And that is not a Turkish phenomenon. And there's also a pattern of such leaders picking younger and younger advisors as their entourage, who are actually sent out to do the bidding and the will, rather than to offer difficult advice. So I think that is a problem. Truth unto power and so on. But I think if I was advising Mr. Erdogan, I would want to appeal to his sense of history and his place in it. And a lot of the issues we've talked about this evening have really been about turn and turn about in Turkish politics. Polarized alternatives, the switch from the previous Kemalist structures to the structures that are now still evolving. And I think what I would want to say is, look, as we go towards 2023, you want to be installing a model that's going to continue evolving after you, but isn't going to be chuck out your baby with the bathwater when the AKP eventually runs out of steam, which, like all other political options, it will. So I would be encouraging him, I think, to think of the legacy, to look at implementing the EU acquis for Turkish reasons, not for EU reasons, and making it harder and harder for EU countries to argue that Turkey shouldn't be a member of the EU. At the same time, I would encourage him to concentrate on what makes the economy strong. And I would encourage him to continue with the process of developing relationships both in the region and beyond, which give Turkey so many more cards as an international player. And the EU acquis reforms would meet the very good point that I think Fadi made, that to step up from the middle income group to the higher income group of economies, I mean, things like women in the workplace, education and so on, really have got to change in Turkey. I mean, paying tax would be quite a good idea for quite a lot of people too. So I think I would appeal to his sense of history. Shall I just deal with the other one that was directed at me about Mr. Öcalan? I mean, I think part of the evidence of the seriousness of Mr. Erdogan's ambition to address the Kurdish issue is a willingness to talk, to make Mr. Öcalan the interlocutor. I mean, in the British model, to the extent you can have an equivalence, we always talk to Sinn Féin, the political front party, not to the IRA. And in the Turkish context, the Turkish government is talking to the PKK rather than to the BDP, because they recognize that in the Turkish context, that's the man who can achieve change. And it's been very interesting to see the extent to which Mr. Öcalan, sitting on his island, can actually keep common cause with the leaders in the mountains, because you could see a natural split between someone as chief negotiator who's actually in the power of his interlocutors, rather than the people in the mountains who are sort of keeping the faith and the fight alive. So I think there have already been concessions about conditions of life for Mr. Öcalan. Release would be something that I don't think the Turkish government could contemplate at the moment. But who knows if you have an evolution, if the settlement works. I mean, I think the most important thing is actually to release a lot of the people who've been held in southeast Turkey for a variety of reasons, and to keep that process going, and to show incremental steps towards a solution. I actually think there have been important steps taken already, but always with the knowledge that this is a truly difficult process in terms of Turkish overall politics, as well as for the Kurds and the southeast. So not imminent release, I would think.
Alex, can I ask you on the same subject? Now, the equation, as Sir David mentioned, about negotiating with Öcalan rather than, say, the HDP, whereas in Ireland it was the other way around. Now, how is that going to create a problem with the government's relationship with the HDP? Because yes, they are claiming that they are not only a pro-Kurdish party, that they've got this left element in the party now, but especially if they go beyond their natural votes, say 10% even, 2% more than what they get normally. If they start getting votes from the Turkish electorate as well, isn't that going to strengthen their position and then create a problem with the negotiations with Öcalan?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are several problems down the line with the government strategy. In particular, what's very striking is that while, like you say, engaging with Öcalan and with the PKK, they've ignored the BDP or you know, the BDP. It's confusing. There's the BDP, which is the Kurdish party, and there's the HDP, which is sort of its affiliate, which tries to appeal to Turkish leftist voters, without much success so far. You know, judging by the recent elections. But the problem is that the government has continued with this really quite harsh rhetoric towards the BDP. And you know, when I speak to BDP politicians, they say that there aren't really very good, there aren't really effective negotiations going on at a lower level between the government and the BDP over what, you know, they want in terms of autonomy. And I think that's a problem because one of the big features over the past decade has been that you know, the atmosphere in Turkey, as a result of the accession process, as a result of the AKP government and its power struggle with the military, is that it's opened a bigger space for civil grassroots political movements, and I think you've really seen that mainly in the Kurdish region through the way in which civilian BDP politicians have become much bigger and more influential figures. You know, the prime example is you know, Osman Baydemir, who was until recently the mayor of Diyarbakir. So the government is sidelining the civilian element of the Kurdish political movement at a time when it's actually becoming more and more important and more influential within the Kurdish region. And I think the reason they're doing that is because they have an eye, as always, they're very pragmatic, they have an eye on votes, and the BDP is their main political rival in the southeast. You know, the AKP is taking a growing share of the votes in the southeast. In Diyarbakir, in local elections, the AKP increased its share of the vote significantly. And I think that I suspect that Erdogan may think that he can hammer something out with Öcalan, pass some kind of reform law, announce that the process is solved, and then hope that that will then sideline the civil Kurdish movement, which I think would be, quite a sort of cynical way to do it, and would have long-term negative consequences. So yeah, I think there are all kinds of problems, like you touched on, the fact that Öcalan is actually in the keeping of, his interlocutors. I mean, it's lots of things about the peace process have huge question marks on them. Although I agree with your assessment that he's determined to solve it in some way.
Can I first go to Karabekir? Then we'll ask you about why you changed your position.
The railway timetable, I think.
Two things, maybe. One, the Armenian issue, which you may want to respond.
Okay. There were very quickly 3 questions. One, the Armenian question. One, Ekmelettin İhsanoğlu versus Erdogan. Why should we, if one were to choose one or the other? And the suggestion that there's a movement from center-right to center-left in Turkey, which I don't see any of it at all. If anything, the party that calls itself center-right is center-left is running to the right and becoming a coalition partner with the nationalists, the MHP. The large bulk of Turkish electorate is firmly on the right. The left is representing parts of the CHP, parts of the Kurdish movement, HDP, and then smaller parties. With regards to the Armenian question and Prime Minister's statement, I'm going to respond with perhaps the most infamous slogan of modern Turkish politics, yetmez ama evet. No, not sufficient, but yes. And that basically, what I basically want to say is it shows, for all its demagogic tricks hidden within the statement, how far Turkey has come in actually facing some of the hardest chapters of its recent history. And that's down to Turkish civil society over the last decade, which this government has to follow, in a sense. It's easy for Prime Minister Erdogan to be apologetic about the Armenian genocide, without calling it a genocide, of course, because it was carried out under the Committee of Union and Progress, whose extension is the Republican People's Party. But nonetheless, he's a believer in the state, in the Turkish state. So incriminating the unionists on this issue will actually corrupts his image of Turkish state as well. So it really reflects how far Turkish civil society has been pushing debate on this issue. There's a lot of room to expand and deepen the debate, but I think that has to be encouraged both inside and outside of Turkey. And just to finish off, I think you gave yourself away when you said, I don't trust Ekmelettin İhsanoğlu necessarily, but I want to give Erdogan a message. I believe as long as there's the main driving force of the opposition is an anti-Erdoganism, they're not going to win. Erdogan has successfully turned any vote, any general election referendum about himself and has won it. As long as the opposition brings out someone who in himself or herself represents some sort of a popular vision for Turkey, Erdogan is bound to win, and then the question of Ekmelettin İhsanoğlu becoming president becomes a bit of hypothetical issue, unfortunately.
And lastly, I guess we were running a bit over. I think we can, as we're discussing Turkey, we can be a bit late.
Sorry, in regards to the first question, the loss of AKP's 2 million votes. If you look at the local elections, the 2 million votes that the AKP lost compared to the general elections of 2011, they went to other right-wing parties, in particular the Grand Union Party, which mixes Islam and nationalism, and it went to the Happiness Party, Saadet Partisi, which is another Islamist party. So what we're seeing in Turkey, one potential scenario is that if the AKP continues losing the ruling Justice Development Party, continues losing votes, we may see them not transfer to the center, to a center-left party, the Republican People's Party, but shift to other right-wing parties. So you might see a fragmentation of the right, as we saw the fragmentation of the left in Turkish politics in the 80s and 90s. As for when did I change my view? It is true that at the beginning I did not support AKP, I supported Erdogan's policies because he followed, he expanded media freedoms, he abolished state security courts, he reduced the role of the military in Turkish politics, and he did this based on consensus. Also, he transformed the whole Cypriot question. So he did this on the basis of consensus. His reforms were supported by the Republican, left-wing, Ataturkist, Kemalist, Republican People's Party in Parliament. There was consensus across the board, left, right, and center. And therefore, I supported the consensual style of politics and reforms that Prime Minister Erdogan followed. Where I did change, and it was much earlier than the Arab Spring, was generally after the 2007 general elections, where Prime Minister Erdogan won 47% of the vote. He started to feel comfortable in power. We began to see a much more confrontational, ideological, less consensual, majoritarian style of politics. It became more obsessed with issues such as the headscarf, rather than freedom and EU accession. And in particular, my road to Damascus was January 2008, when I was in Ankara at the time. I opened the newspaper. I read that Prime Minister Erdogan was giving a press conference, and one of the questions asked, "Is the headscarf a political symbol?" He did not. He said, "Yes, it is." So what? So he reduced the headscarf from freedom issue to a political symbol issue. Then I understood that he was on the road towards greater ideological, majoritarian, less consensual style of politics. And that's what we saw. And this was further aggravated by his performance in Davos, where he did this, where 1 minute when he attacked the Israeli president, Shimon Peres. As a Palestinian myself, I've seen that last 50 years. It achieves nothing. It's very nice theatrics. But at the end of the day, the net result is zero. And we have seen the net result of this style of politics, at least in the region, has not produced any lasting change.
Okay, I think I'm afraid we'll have to stop now. I'm sorry, there are a couple of more people who wanted to ask questions. Thank you for all of you for making this contribution. It's a very complex issue, maybe for people who are not Turkish or familiar with Turkish politics. But it was a quite lively contribution from all of you, and some valuable insights. And thank you for all coming and being part of it. And hopefully we'll have another one soon. Thank you.